They didn't build the pyramids with slaves. They built them with tired men who slept next to corpses. Hollywood lied. The truth is stranger and quieter. The workers who carved stones for the pharaohs didn't live in chains. They lived in state-funded villages, ate garlic and onions for strength, drank beer that was thick as porridge, and when the day was done, they laid their heads down just a few feet from tombs filled with the freshly embalmed dead. Some had families. Some were temporary laborers. Some were craftsmen, paid in grain. But they all ended their days with the dead. Before we go further, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. And if you enjoy these quiet reflections on forgotten lives, consider subscribing. No pressure, only if it feels right. Maybe leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where in the world these stories find their home. It wasn't a punishment. It was the job. They hauled limestone by day and shared walls with the deceased by night. The scent of resin and natron clung to everything. Sleep came with the smell of eternity. The linen-wrapped corpses were stored nearby, sometimes still awaiting their gilded coffins. Mummification wasn't a quick process. It took 70 days, and the workers lived alongside that slow transformation. They heard the priest chanting in the distance. They saw the body arrive and leave in different forms. In between hauling stones, workers joked, argued, and played games with knuckle bones. They wrote graffiti about their bosses and scratched sketches into stone blocks. One record shows a labor strike over missed rations, possibly the first in recorded history. These were people with agency, even if their lives were hard. They were proud of their work, proud to build for eternity. But that pride had a shadow. Imagine falling asleep knowing that behind the wall was someone's husband, mother, or son, slowly drying into the afterlife. That the building you worked on all day was a tomb meant to last forever. That your own body might one day end up in the sand outside its walls. Death wasn't hidden. It was daily, physical, intimate. Why did they do it? How did it work? And what did it mean to dream while death slept inches away? What did they tell themselves as they laid their heads down and the stars turned over the desert? Did they dream of kings, of gold, or just of silence? That's what we're getting into. The people who built the pyramids didn't commute from far-off cities. They lived right next to the dead. Just steps away from where they shaped stone, they slept in mud brick homes, cramped, sun-baked, and humming with life. The layout was simple: narrow lanes, flat roofs, communal courtyards. Orderly, efficient. It was a neighborhood built by the living for the dead. Each house had its own flavor. Some were painted in faded whitewash, others left bare, streaked with soot from cooking fires. Children played in the alleys, tossing bones like dice, while goats picked their way around stone blocks and buckets of mortar. At night, the smell of barley porridge and lentil stew filled the air, mixing with the ever-present tang of salt and embalming oils drifting from the tomb shafts. The village backed up to the tomb shafts. The dividing line between life and death wasn't a wall. It was a footpath. On one side, workers eating lentils, drinking beer, and patching sandals. On the other, sealed chambers full of linen-wrapped corpses, guarded statues, and walls painted with stars. There were no signs or warnings. Everyone knew what lay beyond the next corner. That nearness wasn't seen as strange. It was necessary. Death needed hands. The dead needed homes. The builders were part of the afterlife machinery. Brick by brick, prayer by prayer. Building a tomb wasn't just a job. It was a sacred responsibility. Every stone laid was a step in someone's journey to the afterlife. And every worker knew you couldn't build eternity without getting close to death. They'd rise with the sun and walk past open tomb pits, still waiting for occupants. Sometimes they helped prepare the bodies. Sometimes they just nodded to the priest passing by with a jar of resin. It wasn't morbid. It wasn't even solemn. It was just the rhythm of things. You hauled stone. You made bricks. You prayed. You slept. Then you did it all again. Some workers were veterans. They'd helped build earlier tombs, knew the angles of every ramp, the weight of every slab. Others were new, barely more than boys, sent by families who hoped they'd earn a stable wage. And then there were the specialists, the painters, the chiselers, the men who shaped gods from granite and left behind their names in the cracks between stones. And at night, when the winds shifted and the heat finally drained from the walls, they lay down on reed mats, their backs aching, their arms sore. The same walls that held their dreams held the scent of embalming oils. They didn't flinch. They didn't question it. They belonged there. The silence was heavy, but not frightening. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone has done their part. They weren't priests. They weren't nobles. But they were close to the divine in their own way. Their fingerprints were pressed into eternity. Their breath mingled with dust that would outlast them all. In their world, the line between this life and the next was thin. Not something to fear, just something to work beside, to live next to sleep under. Before dawn, the village stirred, quietly, without alarm. A cough, a soft clatter of clay, the sound of someone brushing dust from a mat. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, but men were already pulling on linen kilts, wrapping headscarves, stretching sore shoulders. In one house, a child whimpered in sleep. In another, someone whispered a prayer for strength. The world hadn't started yet, but the work already waited. They worked in shifts, not because it made things easier, but because the stone demanded it. Some carved, some hauled, some stood knee-deep in pits shaping raw blocks under the weight of the day. Others transported food, water, tools. A few sharpened chisels on sandstone blocks while muttering curses under their breath. Everyone was part of something larger, an effort that had no room for pride, but plenty for precision. One chipped edge could spoil a slab. One careless pull could break a rope and cost a man his foot. Breakfast was bread and beer, flat loaves with bits of chaff still in them. Beer thick as soup, made with dates and left to ferment in clay jars. It didn't taste good, but it was filling. No one lingered. Meals were swallowed in motion. A few joked around mouthfuls. Most ate in silence, already half focused on the day's tasks. Sometimes the bread was shared with a neighbor whose ration had run dry. Hunger was common, but so was quiet generosity. The walk to the site passed tomb entrances, some half-finished, their walls raw and unpainted, some sealed, already silent. Even in progress, each tomb had a weight to it, like a deep breath held under stone. Workers avoided looking inside if they could help it, not out of fear, but out of respect. The dead didn't like to be watched. They didn't speak of it, but everyone felt it. That subtle pressure in the chest when they stepped too close. Tools were stored in shared sheds, copper chisels, dolerite pounders, lengths of rope, wedges, sleds. Everything had its place. You didn't take another man's chisel. You didn't leave yours dull. The foremen walked the lines with folded arms, calling out corrections without raising their voices. They didn't need to yell. Everyone knew the stakes. A missed line in a wall could mean hours lost. A split stone might take days to replace. The heat came quickly. Within an hour of sunrise, it was already hard to breathe. Sweat pooled at the base of spines, turned dust to mud on bare feet. Hands blistered beneath linen wraps. Eyes squinted against the glare bouncing off limestone. But no one stopped. Work meant survival. It meant rations, and in some quiet way, it meant legacy. Their labor would last longer than their lives. That was something to hold on to. These weren't nameless laborers. Many had names carved on limestone flakes, offhand sketches, fragments of jokes, notes to the gods. Some scratched simple prayers, "Let my family eat." Others drew tiny scenes, men at work, animals, strange gods with wide eyes. A mark left behind in the margins of history, not glory, just proof. A way of saying, I was here, I mattered, and when the sun reached its peak, when the work slowed just enough to allow a pause, some of them stood in the shade and looked up, not at the sky, but at the stone, rising slowly above them, a shape forming against time, a monument they would never be buried in, but one they had helped give life to. Sometimes a man would point at a block and say, "That one's mine," even if he knew it would be swallowed by hundreds more. Then they bent down, picked up their tools, and kept carving, not for honor, not for pharaohs, but because the stone didn't shape itself, because the work was waiting, because someone had to carry the future on a sunburned back. The dead were not silent. Even after they were wrapped and sealed, they required constant tending, rituals, maintenance, protection. The tomb wasn't a final resting place. It was a vessel in motion. Without care, the soul could lose its way. Without offerings, it could wither. The afterlife wasn't guaranteed by death alone. It had to be sustained, nurtured, federal. So the workers didn't just build the tomb. They returned to it, again and again, days, weeks, sometimes years later. There were rituals that marked the days after burial, the opening of the mouth, the anointing with oils, the lighting of lamps at specific intervals. These acts tied the living to the dead, just as stone tied the desert to the stars. There were daily tasks, clearing sand from the entrance, inspecting the ceiling stones for cracks, replacing oils, refreshing incense. The wind could undo days of work in a single night. A collapsed shaft or broken seal wasn't just a maintenance problem, it was a spiritual emergency. Some of this was done by priests. Some was done by the same hands that had carved the burial shaft. Laborers became caretakers. Builders became guardians. The body itself changed over time. As it dried and shrank, new wrappings were added. Amulets were checked and repositioned, sometimes replaced if damaged. Layers of linen were wound tightly to maintain shape, infused with oils and prayers. The bandages themselves could loosen, requiring careful rewrapping by those trained in funerary care. Insects were a constant threat. Beetles and flies drawn to the slightest scent. Mold, too. If even a small amount of moisture seeped into the chamber, spores could bloom on the walls, creep into the wrappings, discolor sacred symbols, and threaten the integrity of the entire burial. The desert wasn't always dry enough. Rainfall, rare as it was, could shift stone or seep through unnoticed cracks. The battle to preserve the body was ongoing, quiet, meticulous, and sacred. Crept in, so did rot. Preservation was a battle, not a one-time act. Inside the tomb, the air was thick, not with decay, mummification took care of that, but with stillness, with expectation. Paintings looked back at you, statues loomed in the flickering light. The gods were there, all of them, painted on the walls, etched in stone, watching. Even with a job to do, workers stepped lightly, whispered, bowed before they entered. They followed paths mapped in ritual, avoiding sacred directions and forbidden corners. Some left offerings of their own, a bead, a chip of stone, a few drops of water poured into the dust. Not required, just respectful. A silent way to say, "I see you, I remember." You couldn't spend your days that close to death and not acknowledge it. And you couldn't keep returning without leaving a part of yourself behind. A sliver of sweat. A breath. A prayer not meant for any god, but for peace. They didn't fear the dead. They feared forgetting them. They feared being forgotten in return. because in a world built on memory, to be remembered was the only form of survival that mattered. Salt didn't just flavor food, it preserved the dead. Natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture found in dry lake beds, was the cornerstone of Egyptian mummification. And for the workers who lived beside the tombs, its presence was constant. It crusted the edges of storage jars. It hung in the air. It burned faintly in the nose. It coated fingers and lips. It seeped into fabric, into wooden beams, into the grooves of stone steps. You could taste it in your breath. You could feel it on your skin. It was part of the texture of daily life, clinging to everything. The process was long, exacting, and quietly sacred. Bodies were stripped, cleaned, and packed in natron for 40 days. The salt pulled every drop of moisture from flesh. Skin darkened, muscles collapsed. The contours of the body changed. Organs were removed and treated separately. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was handled with reverence and care. The brain, not so much, often pulled through the nose and discarded without ceremony. It was seen as excess, useless in the next world. The removed organs were sealed in canopic jars, each topped with the head of a protective deity. The workers saw all this, not always directly, but often enough. A body entering one room, a priest chanting in another. The smell of pine resin and incense barely covered what lay beneath. It was sharp, pungent, the scent of transformation. There were rules, of course, boundaries, rituals, but proximity blurred everything. Death wasn't a mystery, it was a craft, a process with tools, steps, mistakes. And the workers, while not embalmers themselves, absorbed it all by osmosis. They came to know the stages, the drying, the wrapping, the sealing. Children played near the drying pits. Dogs sniffed at the edges of funerary workshops. Women fetched water, just a few steps from the embalmer's chambers. Life didn't stop, because death was close. It adjusted around it. It folded into it. The rhythms of labor and the rituals of burial moved alongside each other, inseparable. Workers would pass drying corpses without looking twice, nodding to embalmers as casually as they would to bricklayers. The embalmers were a class of their own, not quite priests, not quite workers. They wore linen wraps, spoke in low voices, and kept their tools clean and orderly. They marked time not by sunrise or sundown, but by stages of decomposition. For them, decay was not feared. It was managed, reversed, preserved. And the builders learned to read their expressions, a furrowed brow over a difficult body, a nod of approval at a job done right. Embalmers were not feared, but respected. Quiet guides who dealt with what lay beyond breath. Some workers came to know the mummification priests by name. They traded tools, shared food, helped carry supplies. There was mutual respect, but also a quiet understanding. One built the tomb, the other prepared what went inside. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was direct, honest, the kind of talk that grows between people who work in the presence of something larger than themselves. Jokes were dry, conversations short, but there was trust, and that was enough. The salt got everywhere, into their food, into their skin, into their sleep. It gathered under fingernails. It flaked off hair. It coated everything with a faint film that shimmered in morning light. It built up in the corners of their homes. It mixed with sweat. It hardened on tools. They dreamt in the smell of natron, in the press of linen, in the rustle of a shroud being wrapped. Some said they could feel it even in their dreams, a scratch at the back of the throat, a dryness that never left. Still, each day, they returned to the stone. They carved. They carried. They shaped the dark corridors of eternity. And when the sun set behind the dunes, they lay down beside the scent of salt and memory, and drifted to sleep among the whispers of the dead. The dead were wrapped in layers, linen soaked in resin, spices packed into cavities, amulets tucked between folds to guard the journey. The mummification process wasn't hidden away in secret chambers. It happened close by, in the open air, or under simple awnings, within earshot of workers eating lunch or sharpening tools. It was part of the world, not separate from it. The smell of embalming fluid mixed with the scent of onions and stewed lentils drifting from cooking pots. Death was not a distant concept. It lived beside them. It worked beside them. Most workers didn't handle the bodies themselves. That was the job of priests and embalmers, men trained to navigate the steps between life and afterlife. But everyone knew what was happening. They heard the prayers. They smelled the incense. They saw the jars, each filled with something removed: stomach, liver, lungs, intestines. They saw the bodies change shape as they dried, watched linen being wound tight, watched eyes disappear behind carved stone lids. The organs were stored in canopic jars, each guarded by a different god: jackal, falcon, baboon, human, small statues standing watch over soft tissue. These jars weren't decorative, they were essential. Without them, the body couldn't be whole in the afterlife. Without them, the journey failed. Some workers believed the jars breathed, that they whispered secrets into the chamber after dark, that the gods weren't just watching, but listening. And so the workers built rooms to house these jars, carved niches in walls, shaped the stone that would hold the soul together. They weren't just building tombs. They were building the architecture of eternity. One block at a time, they formed the map for a spirit to follow. A safe path through the underworld, lit by lamplight, sealed in silence. Occasionally, a worker would be asked to assist, to carry a jar, to lift a wrapped form, to hold a torch as the mouth of the tomb was sealed. These were solemn tasks, not taken lightly. You didn't speak much on days like that. You moved carefully. You remembered every step. A misstep could disturb the soul. A dropped jar could unmake a future. So they worked with hands steady and eyes downcast. On those days, conversation stopped early. Even laughter died in the throat. Workers ate in silence, scraped the last of their meal from clay bowls, and went to bed early, listening to the desert wind press against the walls like a second breath. Afterward, they returned to their homes, washed the scent of death from their arms, and sat with their families as the sky turned gold over the desert. Children climbed into their laps. Bread was broken. The day felt long, but not heavy. There was peace in the ritual. There was no fear in it, only repetition, only reverence, only the understanding that one day someone else would carry your jar, and someone else would remember to move carefully, and the sun would rise again over stones that remembered your name. They didn't call it grave robbing. Not the ones who did it. Not always. To them, it was recovery, rebalancing, making right what the rich had taken with them. Even in a place as obsessed with the afterlife as ancient Egypt, not everyone believed the dead should keep their gold, especially when the living were hungry. Gold, sealed in stone chambers, couldn't feed your children. It couldn't patch your roof or trade for barley. And while priests insisted that pharaohs needed treasures in the afterlife, workers saw the treasures rot behind walls, untouched, unneeded. Faith clashed with survival, and survival often won. Some of the pyramid workers knew exactly where the wealth was buried. They carved the chambers. They watched the priests seal them. They knew which stones were hollow, which doors were decoys, which passage led to the real tomb. They remembered every false wall and hidden turn. And years later, when the economy faltered, when the granaries ran low, when wages didn't come, they remembered. They talked quietly. No plans, not really, just questions. Is that old tomb still sealed? Did the guards ever come back? Did you ever see what they put inside? A nod was often enough. Not all workers returned to rob, but some did. Others stayed behind while friends vanished into the desert with torches and chisels, hoping to crack open eternity and take a handful for themselves. They didn't speak of it openly, but the silences were heavy, the gazes too long. Everyone knew someone who had gone back to a tomb they'd once helped build. Some returned with trinkets, scraps of gold, bits of broken jewelry. Others didn't return at all. The tombs were supposed to be eternal. But eternity is fragile. One crack in a seal, one missing guard, one night too quiet. That's all it took. Once the first stone moved, the sanctity vanished. Behind the carved gods and painted stars were boxes. And inside the boxes, things people could use. And the workers knew every weakness. They had built them all. They knew which shafts had real treasures and which were filled with pottery. They knew how long it would take before the embalming scent faded. They knew when the priests rotated their patrols. They knew how to shift a stone slab with silence. They had lifted those slabs before, but with reverence. Now, they did it with hunger. To them, it wasn't desecration. It was returning the goods to the world of the living. The gods could keep their statues, but the people needed bread. Not every robbery was about gold. Some just wanted tools, oil, linen, a coin to trade. Even a clean jar could be worth the risk. And when the haul was done, they left quietly. No boasting, no trail, just dust. The desert took most of them, but for a few nights they walked again in the dark, through corridors they once lit with purpose, now lit with need. And somewhere beneath the sand, their footprints crossed their own. They worked with the dead, but they also worked with the sacred. Every tool they touched, every chisel, hammer, smoothing stone, and copper blade had a purpose. And that purpose wasn't just architectural. It was spiritual. The tombs they helped carve were meant to hold the divine, not just the body of a king, but his transformation. Death, to them, wasn't an end. It was a journey, a doorway. And they were the ones building the threshold. They weren't just laborers. They were midwives to the afterlife, shaping the passage from this world to the next, one stone at a time, one breath at a time. Inside the tombs, the air was different, cooler. Still, dust clung to the skin like memory. The deeper you went, the more the world outside seemed to fade. Sound disappeared. Time felt slower, as if it, too, were buried in the layers of stone. Hieroglyphs lined the walls in rows like waves, painted in ochre, lapis, malachite, and charcoal. Scenes of the afterlife, of weighing hearts, of sailing into the stars, of Anubis watching, of Osiris judging, of a soul passing or failing to pass. The walls told a story, and every worker added a line with each stroke of brush and blade. The workers didn't just build those walls, they knew what they meant. Some had memorized the stories. Some had family who served as temple scribes. Some had simply heard enough over the years to know that what they were doing mattered far beyond their own lives. They weren't just digging rooms. They were preparing space for eternity. These were not temporary structures. They were designed to last longer than memory itself. And somehow, that knowledge passed into the hands that lifted stone, stirred pigment, and smoothed plaster. It passed into the rhythm of their steps, the slowness of their labor, the reverence of their silence. They worked in teams. Some shaped the stone. Others mixed the plaster. Others painted, layer upon layer, using natural brushes made from reeds and hair. They sang while they worked, quiet songs, repetitive, not for entertainment, but for focus. Rhythm, breath, sound to keep the hands moving and the heart anchored. Each line of pigment followed a set of rules. The wrong symbol, the wrong shade, the wrong placement could disturb the order of things. It wasn't art. It was function, a coded map for the soul. No detail was too small. Ceilings were painted to resemble the sky. stars arranged in sacred patterns, columns shaped like lotus stalks, door lintels etched with protective spells. The work had to be exact, even if no one would see it for thousands of years, especially because no one would. That was the point. The invisible lasted. The unseen mattered. What lay hidden beneath the sand would speak long after voices faded. And in that stillness, in that darkness, the gods would watch. They didn't rush. They couldn't. You don't hurry when you're building something meant to last forever. When every mistake feels like an insult to the gods. When the thing you're carving is not just a tomb, but a vessel for the soul's journey through the night sky. It had to be precise, not for pride, but for balance, for harmony, for the unseen weight of the afterlife that hung over every chamber, and all around them, in the shafts and chambers and corridors, were the signs of what came next. The jars that would hold the organs, the amulets for protection, the long stone boxes that would cradle what once had breath. They carried these objects in silence, their footsteps muffled by dust. Even the act of moving a sarcophagus had its ritual. Its weight wasn't just in stone, it was in story, in memory, in expectation. They worked with purpose, with reverence, with sweat and stillness. And when the day was done, they washed the dust from their hands and walked home through the same narrow paths that passed the tombs. They greeted the setting sun like an old friend. They sat in the quiet of their homes, bodies sore, hearts steady. Even in silence, the tombs spoke, and the workers listened and carried the sound with them, deep into the night. The work never stopped, not for festivals, not for funerals, not even for death. A man could die hauling limestone, and by sundown his replacement would already be moving into his spot on the line. His tools reused, his mat slept on, his name barely whispered. There were no grand rites for workers, just a shallow grave outside the village and a few murmured words, if that. Maybe a glance from a fellow laborer, maybe nothing at all. The sun would rise the next day like nothing happened. The stone would still need cutting. Inside the tombs, the pharaohs were prepared for eternity, their organs removed, their faces gilded, their coffins carved with spells and maps for the afterlife. They were wrapped in gold, in myth, in sacred expectation. Their passage to the next world was marked with ceremony, chants, and incense. But the men who built those chambers didn't receive blessings. They received bruises, calluses, and silence, cracked skin and sunburnt shoulders, bent spines and worn knees, torn fingernails and joints that popped with every motion. And still, they worked. Death was everywhere, but grief had no place. There was no time for it, no room. Grief slowed the line. Grief made your hands shake, and shaking hands dropped stones. It was understood that tears were a luxury. If a man cried, he did it alone. Face turned to the wall, heart clenched tight like a fist. There was no space for softness. The embalmers moved methodically, slicing, draining, stuffing, wrapping. Their hands were steady, their voices low. The smell of resin filled the air, clinging to the walls, to the workers, to the back of your throat. It lingered in your hair, in your clothes, in the creases of your hands. Nearby, someone hammered a lintel into place. Someone else boiled barley. A child cried. A man cursed. It all happened at once. Life continued even when life ended. One breath beside a final one. One step beside a still body. There were no speeches. No break in the day. If a man collapsed, he was carried out of the way. If he died, he was taken away quietly. Someone else picked up his load. The work adjusted, absorbed the absence like sand covering footprints. Soon, there was no trace. No one paused. No one wept openly. No one expected anything different, because dying on the job site wasn't unusual. It was understood. The sun, the stone, the strain, it took its toll. Bones cracked. Backs failed. Infection spread fast. A cut from a chisel could turn lethal by morning. The dust got into everything. Wounds, lungs, food. It was hard to breathe without feeling scraped raw. And still, the line kept moving. Some workers knew the risks. Others pretended not to. Everyone hoped to last long enough to earn their grain, to send something back to their families, to not fall face first into the sand one day with no one to lift them up. A few tried to leave. Most came back. There was no better work. Just other kinds of dying. They carved kings into stone, but were never carved themselves. They shaped the symbols of eternity while knowing they had none. The only thing that lasted was the work, not the workers. The stones they laid would stand for millennia. Their names would not. And they knew it. They didn't ask for statues. They just hoped not to be buried alone. They just hoped someone would remember where they fell, even if only for a day. They believed in the weight of the heart. Not metaphorically. Literally. At death, the heart was measured against a feather, a real one, placed on a scale by the gods. If your heart was heavier, with sin, with lies, with what you failed to do, you didn't pass into the afterlife. You were eaten, erased, your name lost, your soul extinguished. That idea shaped everything. It shaped how tombs were built, how rituals were performed, how workers carved spells into limestone to protect the dead from judgment. It shaped how they lived, too, because no one wanted to drag a heavy heart into the next world. The feather belonged to Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance, and the heart wasn't just an organ. It was the ledger of your life. So the laborers worked with care. They didn't just haul stones and mix mortar. They helped prepare the magic. They made room for eternity, line by line. They helped paint the ceiling stars, gold on deep blue, each stroke a guide through the sky. They helped seal the sacred doors, ensured the final passage remained undisturbed. The tomb wasn't just a room. It was a vessel, a map, a place between this world and the next. They also watched. They watched the priests recite the correct words in the correct order, watched as the jars were filled with organs, as the wrappings were folded tight and tied with red string. The dead couldn't protect themselves. It took living hands to do it. Sometimes the workers assisted in the rituals, handing over tools, mixing oils, adjusting a linen band. They knew the smells, the chants, the feel of sacred weight. Mistakes were feared. A name misspelled. A door misaligned. A line of text forgotten. Those errors mattered. They could change everything. A single glyph in the wrong place might mean the spirit couldn't speak its name at the gates, might be denied bread, might be left to wander, thirsty and voiceless. Workers whispered stories about what happened to the ones who got it wrong. Souls trapped, curses triggered, or worse, judgment failed, a heart thrown to the devourer. Even if they didn't believe all of it, they didn't take chances. Because belief wasn't required for the system to function. Precision was. Devotion was. Diligence was. You kept your heart light. You did your job well. You paid respect to names. You followed the order. You lived in the shadow of the dead. And you remembered, one day that tomb might be yours. And no one wanted to enter the afterlife unprepared. Not when the scale waited. Not when the feather hovered. Not when your entire soul could come down to a single breath, held too long. So they worked gently, and they hoped it was enough. There was a smell to everything. Not just the obvious, not just the sweat, the sun, the crushed rock, the cheap beer, the lentils, but the dead. Not rotting, not rank, not decayed, preserved, chemical, stubborn. It clung to the air, soaked into cloth, lingered in corners. The workers didn't flinch at it. They barely noticed. Like the drone of insects, or the glare of the sun. It was just part of the day. The scent of natron clung to the linen. Resin soaked into the wood. Incense didn't mask it. It only layered on top. Every breeze carried a whisper of the afterlife. It rode in through the alleys of the workers' village, drifted over rooftops, seeped into sleeping mats. For the pyramid workers, it was normal. The same way stone dust settled in their hair, the same way their palms stayed calloused, the same way they stopped noticing the sound of chisels by noon. Even their own sweat smelled faintly of salt and sunburn. There were no clean lines between the sacred and the ordinary. Not anymore. They didn't talk about it, the smell, the weight of it. It was just part of the air, like heat, like sand, like time. You didn't question it. You worked with it. You slept with it. You woke with it in your nose and your mouth and your clothes. It never left. It followed you into your dreams. Not nightmares, just presence. A sense that someone or something was always nearby. Death had a texture too. Rough cloth, waxy skin, polished canopic jars, cool stone, sand embedded in everything. The workers didn't touch the bodies often, but sometimes they did. To help move a lid, to carry supplies, to assist when the priests were short-handed, and when they did, they were careful. Not out of fear, but respect. This wasn't superstition. It was proximity, intimacy, familiarity with the border between this world and the next. A knowledge that your own hands could shape a god's resting place. Some men helped stitch the shrouds. Some prepared the stone sarcophagi. Some applied pigment to the eyes of carved gods. Others swept floors, carried baskets of limestone chips, held oil lamps steady while inscriptions were finished. All of them, at some point, ended up brushing the edge of the beyond. A hand on a funerary bed, a brush dipped in ochre, a shoulder pressed against a tomb wall while adjusting a lintel. They all left fingerprints somewhere. Many left names, too, scratched into a hidden stone, drawn in charcoal under a tile, signed with the quiet confidence of someone who understood how long a tomb might last. They lived one wall away from silence. The tombs were rarely empty. Even before burial, even before the body arrived, there were signs of occupation, carvings half finished, color drying on plaster, statues waiting to be wrapped, bowls of offering placed in corners, half filled with dates or dried bread, the echo of a chant that had ended an hour ago still lingering in the stillness. The air stayed cooler in there, even during the hottest weeks, and quiet, exceptionally quiet. You didn't speak loudly in a tomb, even if you were alone. In that space, the workers spent hours. They adjusted the alignment of bricks. They lifted beams. They decorated ceilings with stars. They rested in the shade when no one was watching, backs against the stone that would one day hold eternity. A sip of water, a wipe of the brow, a moment to breathe where death was not threat, but design. Sometimes they talked to the dead, not out loud, but in the way people do when they work beside something greater than themselves. A small gesture, a pause before crossing a threshold, a nod to a sealed doorway, an extra moment smoothing the paint on a sacred symbol. Not prayer, not quite, but close, closer than most people ever got. They didn't see ghosts, but they understood presence. They understood legacy. They knew the difference between emptiness and waiting. Some said you could feel it when the body arrived, like the tomb took a breath and held it, like the walls leaned in to listen. The dead weren't gone. They were just farther along, and the workers were building the road, stone by stone, in silence, in heat, in devotion that no one saw but everyone felt, in lives that touched the edge of eternity, then kept moving. There were rules about how a body became eternal, not laws in the civic sense, but sacred steps, precise, methodical, unbreakable. The pyramid builders didn't just raise stone. They raised the dead. Death here didn't arrive with chaos. It came with rhythm, structure, and ancient memory. Every cut, every wrap of linen, every whispered spell had meaning. First came the washing. The body was rinsed in water, scented with sacred herbs. Palms were pressed gently over limbs. Eyes were closed with fingers that knew this movement well. Then the cutting. The organs were removed, one by one, in a set order. The liver, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, each carefully placed in its own canopic jar, each jar bearing the face of a protective deity. These were not just containers. They were guardians. The heart was sometimes removed, sometimes left inside, depending on the era, the beliefs of the deceased, or the wealth of the family. The brain, that was scooped out through the nose with a hooked instrument and discarded, the act done with practiced calm. After that, the drying. 40 days buried in natron salt. 40 days of silence while the body shrank, stiffened, and took on the weightlessness of death. Skin pulled tight, features blurred, bones hardened beneath a husk of preserved flesh. Eyes were replaced with small stones or bits of resin. The mouth was stuffed with linen, sculpted into a gentle shape that looked like it was still ready to speak. The smell of salt and resin filled the rooms. The scent was not unpleasant, just permanent. The workers saw it all, smelled it, lived beside it. The embalmers were just a few courtyards away. Their rooms were dark, their walls cool, their tools lined up like instruments. You could be mending a sandal while a priest recited spells over someone's withered limbs. You could be pouring beer into a clay mug while someone nearby wrapped the arms of a child who had died too young. Life did not stop for death. It moved alongside it. It didn't disturb them. It wasn't gruesome. It was necessary. It was correct. Death wasn't the end, just a door that needed the right key. The wrapping, the oils, the prayers. Those were the keys. The Book of the Dead had maps and spells. The embalmers had hands and memory. The tomb had walls, sealed and painted. Each part played its role, and everyone nearby, the builders, the cooks, the men hauling water from the Nile, they knew it. They heard the chants. They saw the bundles of linen. They caught glimpses of gold amulets pressed into chests. They didn't turn away. They nodded and kept working. They respected the stillness. They weren't just laborers. They were part of the journey. They were quiet ushers of the eternal. They were witnesses to resurrection. By the 13th day of work in a long stretch with no rest, the village grew quiet in a particular way. Not because people weren't talking, but because their voices got smaller, more automatic. It was the silence of repetition, of backs that had bent too many times, of hands that knew exactly how much to lift, how far to walk, how to brace against the stone when your shoulder was already raw. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt lived in, like the bottom of a worn sandal, molded by time and pressure. The bodies moved like clockwork. Wake up, eat bread and onions, walk to the quarry, move stone, return, sharpen a chisel, sleep. No one complained aloud. There was no energy for it. Complaints lived in the way a man sat down a little slower, in the way someone took longer to get up, in the sound of fewer jokes over the evening fire. Even laughter, when it came, was softer, more like an exhale than a noise. Some workers marked the passing days with lines scratched into their door frames. Others didn't need to. Their muscles told them everything. The rhythm of their exhaustion had its own calendar. Knees that creaked a little louder, fingers that curled slower each morning, the dull ache that never went away but became familiar. And still, the tombs rose. Not fast, never fast, but with the weight of certainty. The shafts deepened, the ramps shifted, the paint supplies were hauled down narrow passageways to chambers that only the dead would ever truly see. There were no blueprints. The plans lived in the heads of foremen, passed through hand gestures, sand drawings, and silent understanding. In one corner of the workyard, men stitched new sandals from woven reeds. Nearby, someone hammered copper into shape, reshaping a chisel head dulled by weeks of use. Another group stacked jars of natron, careful not to spill. These weren't big, dramatic moments, but they were part of the machinery that made the tomb breathe. Every motion mattered. Even a dropped tool could mean delay or injury. Someone watered the paths to keep the dust down. Someone else brewed beer from leftover barley mash, thick and bitter but filling. Meals were short and quiet. Bowls passed hand to hand. Elbows bumped as bodies sat close, shoulder to shoulder in narrow shade. No one spoke of tomorrow, just what needed doing before sundown. The embalmers passed through quietly, carrying their bundles. There was no ceremony, just work. The smell followed them for hours. Resin, oil, human stillness, the scent of transition. Everyone knew what it meant. No one turned to look, not out of disrespect, but because they didn't need to. They felt it in their bones. When night came, the workers didn't lie awake thinking about eternity. They thought about the heat trapped in their walls, the way the stone pressed back when you tried to rest against it, the taste of water too warm to be refreshing. They slept the way people do when they have no choice. Deep, fast, dreamless. And when they woke, it started again. They didn't speak in grand terms. They didn't think of legacy. They thought about their feet, their tools, the body that needed to keep going, and the weight of what they carried, one slab at a time. The pyramids weren't built in triumph. They were built in exhaustion, day after day, breath after breath, until the stone stopped moving, and even then, the dust stayed in the air a little longer. The tools they used were simple: copper chisels, wooden mallets, dolerite pounding stones. Nothing fancy, nothing magical, just enough to cut stone and shape silence. They didn't have machines. They had hands, and those hands left behind some of the most precise architecture the world has ever seen. Their work was measured not in weeks or years, but in how long it would last against wind, sun, and time itself. The stones they cut were meant to outlive memory, but those same hands also ached, split. Bled skin tore at the knuckles, nails blackened, calluses grew thick, then peeled away. Day after day, the stone bit back. No one escaped it. Even the strongest left the day bruised, stiff, sore. Fingers calloused from pulling rope, palms cracked from lifting limestone in the dry heat. Back muscles tight from pushing sleds across sand made slick with water. Ankles swollen, hips stiff, shoulders rubbed raw from carrying too much, too often. Every task was physical. Every mistake could cost someone a foot, a tooth, a life. A slipped tool. A falling block. One moment of inattention could mean a crushed rib, a shattered leg, or worse. You learned quickly, or you didn't last. In the nearby clinics, basic sunlit rooms lined with reed mats, workers were treated with honey, linen bandages, splints made from palm wood. Bones were set, cuts were cleaned. They used beer as antiseptic. Papyrus scrolls offered advice, poultices for burns, prayers for infection, incantations mixed with ointment. Medicine was faith and trial in equal parts. A healer might chant over your wound while grinding herbs between stones. Hope was part of the cure. Sometimes it was the only part. Some injuries ended a man's work. Others became part of him. A crooked hand, a stiff gait, a scar that never faded. These weren't signs of weakness. They were the price of doing something eternal. A broken thumb healed crooked, but he learned to hold the chisel differently. A limp from a crushed toe meant slower walking, but he still climbed ladders. A gash across the forehead turned into a scar that marked him for life. There was no retirement, no pensions, but there was pride. You didn't need to be perfect to be useful. You just needed to show up. Bruised didn't mean broken. Hurting didn't mean stopping. They tied rags around swollen joints. They spit on their hands before lifting. They braced their knees with strips of bark. They shared balms made from fat and ash. They laughed when they could, cursed when they had to. Songs passed from mouth to mouth, chants to keep the rhythm, to pass the time. Some songs were nonsense. Some were prayers. Some were both. At night, they slept next to the dead. Not just the embalmed ones, but the memory of friends who hadn't made it through the season. Men who once shared a wall, a tool, a joke, now wrapped and sealed below the floor. Grief didn't have ceremony. It was folded into the day like dust into bread. The nights were cooler, but not restful. Dreams blurred with memory. Bodies groaned on mats, pressed close for warmth. Someone always coughed. Someone always muttered in their sleep. And the scent of resin from the tombs never quite left the air. It clung to their skin, their breath, their dreams. Some nights, they talked, quietly, about home, about food, about the afterlife, whether it was real, whether it was worth all this. But most nights, they just lay still. Let the soreness spread. Let the silence settle. In the morning, they picked up the tools again. Calloused hands gripped worn handles. Bare feet hit the stone. The job waited. The stone waited. The job was unfinished. The stone didn't care if your hand hurt. The sun didn't care if you limped. The tomb would not build itself. So, you worked anyway. Because this was the job. Because the king would die. Because the tomb must be ready. Because the desert never stops. Because eternity demanded it. Because when your name was forgotten, the stones would still speak for you. The tombs weren't just monuments. They were machines. Designed to last forever, every inch of a royal tomb was built with function in mind. Not just to hold a body, but to protect it, preserve it, guide it, and elevate it. Every corridor, every carving, every canopic jar had a role to play in the afterlife of the pharaoh. These weren't decorative. They were operational. The tomb was the vessel. The magic was in the details. To walk into a tomb under construction was to step into a massive humming process, not loud, but alive with purpose. From the outside, it might look like dust and stone. Inside, it was choreography. Measured, methodical. Each crew with its own rhythm. Teams moving past one another like gears in something ancient and exacting. For the workers, this wasn't abstract. They saw it in pieces. Blocks hauled up ramps. Pigments mixed in shade. Chisel marks becoming sacred stories. They rarely saw the whole. Just the tasks, the rhythms, the repetition. Every job was essential, even if no one said so out loud. Even if no one ever saw your name. A painter might spend an entire week brushing blue onto the ceiling to represent the sky. One color, one brush, one arm raised overhead until it ached. The stars he painted weren't symbols. They were literal, a map for the soul to travel through the afterlife. Each star had a name, each constellation a function. The ceiling wasn't art. It was a sky you could pass through. Stonecutters worked by lamplight, tracing spells into walls, not reading them, just copying what the scribes laid out in red ink, line by line, symbol by symbol. They didn't need to know the meaning. The act was what mattered. Accuracy was devotion. One wrong mark, one skipped figure, and the entire spell could be broken. So they worked slowly, hands steady, eyes strained. The air inside was cool, heavy with limestone dust. The smell of oil lamps mixed with crushed minerals and sweat. Skin carried a permanent film of stone. No one spoke much. Voices echoed too easily in the narrow chambers. So they worked quietly, with the hum of picks, the scrape of plaster, and the brush of robes passing in the dark. Every chamber had its purpose. A place for the body, a place for organs, a place for treasures, a place for prayers, a false door for the spirit to walk through, a shaft to let in the sun, a niche for the gods. The workers would never see these rooms again once they were sealed. They built them to be closed, permanently, buried beneath sand and time. That knowledge didn't make them sad. It made them careful. They moved slower near the final chambers, double-checked every alignment, retied every bundle of linen, dusted each surface before leaving, not because someone would inspect it, but because it mattered. This was the last time anyone would see it, the last touch, the last breath of human presence. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted, no corner unmarked, no gesture without weight. Because once the last stone was in place, it was meant to stay there forever, and forever had to start right. Salt did more than dry the dead. It settled on everything. It coated the walls in a fine film. It clung to workers' arms, crept under fingernails, lodged in the creases of sun-leathered skin. It floated in the air, ghost-like, shimmering when light caught it just right. Workers inhaled it, exhaled it, sweated it out, wore it like a second skin. Natron, a naturally occurring mix of sodium carbonate, baking soda, and other minerals, was the backbone of mummification, and it blanketed their world. It stiffened the fibers of their tunics, lined the cracks in their sandals, and scratched at the backs of their throats. The taste stayed long after the day was over. They used it by the sackful, poured into stone basins, packed into the folds of linen-wrapped corpses. It absorbed moisture. It drew life out, grain by grain. The process wasn't quick. Mummification took 70 days, and throughout, the bodies needed tending. Workers in the embalming rooms, low-ceilinged, dim, hot even in the evenings, had to repack the salt, shift the bodies, monitor the progress. Every movement had to be careful, precise. The line between preservation and damage was thin. Mistakes didn't get fixed. They were just absorbed into the final product. The rooms themselves were quiet. Oil lamps cast long shadows over resin-streaked walls. The only sounds were the rustle of linen, the scrape of bronze tools, and the occasional low chant from a passing priest. Outside, the sun blazed. Inside, time folded inward. No clocks, no day and night, just the slow progression of decay turned into eternity. Those who worked closest to the bodies changed over time. Some stopped speaking during the day, their mouths forming silent prayers or staying closed altogether. Others developed a sixth sense, a way of knowing when a body had reached the right stage, when the salt had done enough. They learned by smell, by the way skin gave under pressure. It wasn't written anywhere. It was passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Some workers marked their days with notches on the stone walls, not to count time, but to show presence, to track how long they had stood witness to this strange, sacred work. They believed the dead deserved attention, not just care. The slowness was part of the offering. Haste was seen as dishonor. Each fold of linen had purpose. Each pinch of natron was measured. Each body, whether noble or common, was prepared the same. The workers who lived near these embalming chambers adapted. They stopped noticing the ever-present smell, a mix of sap, spice, death, and salt. They stepped around urns filled with drying organs. They rinsed their hands in basins streaked with fat and resin. Children ran errands past doorways where bodies rested in stillness. Cats curled near embalming tables, drawn by warmth and silence. Nothing was out of place. Meals were taken just beyond the reach of the tombs. Men and women squatted on stone thresholds, sharing bowls of lentils and bread, drinking thick beer. Conversation came in soft tones, drifting between chores and questions about what came after death. There were no long debates, no grand philosophies, just shared acceptance. The dead weren't gone. They were still nearby, still in process. They were never spoken of with fear. No one mentioned curses. No one whispered about hauntings. The dead were not restless. They were simply busy, traveling from one world to the next. The line between the living and the preserved was porous. You could touch it. You could sleep beside it. Bodies dried into permanence while the living moved among them, breathing, eating, working. The work was prayer. The ritual was muscle. And salt made it possible. Salt was the tool. Salt was the symbol. Salt was the silence between two worlds. Everyone had a role, even salt, especially salt. The dead weren't silent. They spoke through the walls, through the objects they left behind, not in voices, but in presence. A comb made of ivory, a pair of sandals tucked beside a wrapped foot, a bracelet etched with prayers to protect the body from what lay beyond, a half-burned cone of incense still clinging to scent, Shabti figurines lined in rows, clay jars of food sealed with wax, the faintest trace of oils soaked into stone. These weren't treasures. They were tools for the afterlife. The workers saw it all. They carried the bodies down the shaft, watched as the priests performed rites, poured resin, wrapped limbs. They saw faces go from flesh to linen, and still they returned to work the next day. They saw the valuables buried, not out of greed, but because someone believed they might need them again. A staff for walking in the next world, a bit of bread, a carved figurine to do the work on the other side, a mirror, a knife, a necklace to remind the spirit of home. The act of burial wasn't an ending. It was a handoff. The soul was meant to continue. The tomb was a portal, not a prison. Sometimes the dead were strangers. Sometimes they were known. A guard, a fellow worker, a child. Someone they'd seen hauling limestone last month. Someone whose laughter they remembered. The dead weren't distant. They were part of the same cycle. Above ground, below ground. Waiting. The lines between roles blurred. One day you might be building a tomb. The next, someone might be building yours. It changed how you slept, how you breathed. Not out of fear, but awareness. You shared the land with the afterlife. You built its entryways. You painted its sky. You shaped the path someone else would follow. Maybe someone you knew. Maybe someone who knew you. You learned to move gently, to speak softly, to carry stone with care. Not because the Pharaoh commanded it, but because everything around you said, "This matters." Every object, every brushstroke, every grain of natron poured over a body. The dead deserved dignity, the tomb deserved silence, and the work deserved attention. Even in the quiet, something was always watching. Maybe a god, maybe your own conscience, maybe the memory of the dead, maybe the ones who hadn't yet died but would. It was hard to tell the difference. Time bent in those tunnels. Life overlapped with what came next. You might feel a draft and think it was breath. You might hear dripping and think it was footsteps. So you did your work with your head down. You hauled stone. You painted stars. You made the walls ready. You laid out mats. You smoothed the plaster. You sang the same lines under your breath as you carved them into the tomb. You crushed pigments. You repaired broken brushes. You whispered apologies when the chisel slipped. You didn't rush. You didn't question. You listened. You waited. You paid attention to what could not speak back. And every night, you slept beside what came after. Not in dread, but in recognition. In solidarity. In shared stillness. Because if you listened closely, the dead were still speaking. Through the work. through the walls, through the hush that followed the last hammer blow. And you were part of the reply, a breath in the dark, a hand steady on the stone. By the time a tomb was almost finished, the whole village felt it. The rhythm changed. Voices dropped lower. Jokes came slower. There was a kind of hush that moved through the alleys and work sites. Not from fear, but from focus. Even the children played more quietly. The animals, too, seemed to stir less. It was as if the land itself was aware that something was about to end. Even the wind sounded different, slower, heavier, dragging along. The outer walls, like it too, was waiting. The final stages were the most delicate. Painters worked in silence, crouched beneath ceilings to fill in constellations, sacred animals and spells written in careful, steady hands. The colors, ochre, lapis, carbon black, had to be mixed just right. Mistakes couldn't be painted over. Every stroke mattered. Chiselers tapped carefully, their hammers wrapped in cloth to soften the sound. Any mistake now would last forever. The gods would see it. So would the dead. There was no rushing, no shortcuts, just hours of patience and breath. Outside, workers packed sand around the ramps, shaped the final steps, and checked joints for weaknesses. The hauling teams were done. Now came the finishers, the polishers, the ones who smoothed over the rough. The noise of stone on stone gave way to the softer rhythm of brushes, ropes, and hands. The ramps that once carried tons of stone now carried silence. Inside, priests prepared the burial chamber. They anointed niches with oils, placed amulets in alcoves, and recited under their breath as they worked. Every object had meaning. Every action echoed with ritual. The air grew heavier with incense, thick with the scent of cedar, resin, and sacred oils. It clung to the walls. It clung to their clothes. It crept into their mouths and their dreams. Everyone knew they were standing at the edge of something, the moment when a structure turned into a tomb, when stone became memory, when the work of years would disappear behind a sealed door, never to be touched again. That awareness weighed on everything. Even laughter, when it came, felt thinner. Time slowed down. People walked differently, with more awareness, with more care, because this wasn't just the end of a project, it was the beginning of permanence. At night, the lamps burned later. Some workers stayed up, sitting quietly near the tomb's entrance, their tools laid beside them, not because they were needed, but because they didn't want to leave. There was something final in the air, something that told them this was the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. They shared bread. They drank quietly. No stories, just presence, just the crackle of flame and the distant sound of the wind slipping between stones. Some stared at their hands, calloused and ink-stained. Others leaned their backs against warm limestone and watched the sky fade from dark blue to black. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't mourning. It was something in between, a kind of reverence, a recognition that what they had built was no longer theirs. It belonged to the king, to the gods, and to time. They had touched eternity, and now it was time to let it go. They didn't speak of it. They just sat there, backs against the cooling walls, the desert sky above them, the sound of wind moving through stone. Occasionally, someone would glance toward the entrance, where darkness gathered like a curtain waiting to fall. A few reached for their tools again, not to work, but to hold. As if letting go would make this moment disappear too quickly. It was almost time. The tomb was ready, and soon it would be sealed, and with it, a chapter of their lives would vanish into the earth, silent, sacred, and closed forever. The work would be buried. Their names would not be remembered, but the stones would hold their fingerprints. The walls would keep their breath, and the silence they left behind would echo for thousands of years. The workers believed in protection, not just from guards or walls, but from spirits, from curses, from whatever might linger after a body had been prepared but not yet buried. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was respect, a kind of alertness, quiet and constant, like a hand resting on the hilt of a blade that may never be drawn. Even for those who didn't fully believe in the afterlife, the rituals were not ignored. To skip them felt dangerous, unwise, like leaving a door open in a storm. They carved protective spells into the walls, not elaborate ones, just enough to guide or warn. A symbol near the door, a line of text above a lintel. Sometimes they placed amulets in the corners of their rooms. Eyes, ankhs, scarabs, tiny things made of clay or faience. These weren't decorations. They were boundaries, thin, sacred lines between the world of the breathing and the world beyond. The more cautious ones even etched prayers onto pots and bowls, ensuring that every gesture, even eating or drinking, remained inside the circle of protection. Some workers even tied cords of dyed linen around their ankles or wrists, not for style, for safety. Something physical to remind the spirits that they were still on the right side of the veil. They might mark a doorway with soot, or tuck a dried flower under their mat. A gesture, a whisper, a quiet request, not to be noticed too much. Bits of bone or salt might be buried at the threshold, not to keep the dead away, but to make sure they came only when invited. In the embalming tents, priests recited specific prayers to keep the body safe during purification. The workers listened, not always understanding the words, but trusting the rhythm. The act of listening itself felt like protection. The voices of the priests were like threads sewn between this world and the next, holding everything together just tightly enough that it didn't unravel. When the priests washed their hands or burned incense, the workers paused, not out of reverence, but because those moments were thresholds, and crossing them thoughtlessly was asking for trouble. They paid attention to the direction a body faced, to the placement of objects around it. They learned over time what the priests would not teach them directly, which prayers to say before entering a tomb, which words to avoid near the recently dead. It wasn't about superstition. It was about order, structure, balance, ma'at. The world had to be kept aligned, or else everything, the stones, the people, the heavens, might fall out of place. They carried that balance into their homes. A bed might face a certain way, not because it was comfortable, but because it was correct. A jug might always rest on the right side of a doorway. Tools were never left out overnight if they'd been used near a tomb. The world of the living had rules, and so did the world of the dead. And where they overlapped, caution was the only wisdom. And then there were the dreams. They didn't talk about them openly, but sometimes, in the early hours, someone would sit up too fast, breath caught in their throat, a face in the dark, a voice that wasn't there, a familiar scent when no one had moved. They said the dead didn't mind company, but they didn't like to be forgotten. And dreams were a way of remembering. They were also, sometimes, warnings. A cracked pillar seen in sleep, a shadow standing in the wrong corner, a whisper that matched no voice among the living. There were stories of workers who dreamed of tombs before they were built, of stones that cracked in sleep before they cracked in life. Sometimes these dreams were seen as warnings, other times as invitations. No one knew for sure, but they treated them with seriousness. No laughing, no scoffing, just quiet nods and the offering of a little bread or beer, sometimes honey, if they could spare it. So every now and then, someone would pour out a little beer or leave a crust of bread by the door, a gesture not of fear, but of acknowledgement, a way of saying, I know you're still here, I remember, I'm paying attention, not because they had to, because it felt right, because rituals, even small ones, kept the world from fraying at the edges. Because in a world full of sand and stone, it was easy to forget the invisible lines, because if the dead were watching, and they often were, it was best to nod back, quietly, with respect, and never more than once. When the tomb was nearly finished, the tone in the village changed. The rush of labor slowed. Chisels rang less often. The hauling of stone gave way to detail work, pigment on plaster, the smoothing of ramps, the polishing of granite. Workers moved more carefully now. Everything had to be perfect. The afterlife didn't accept shortcuts. There was no room for sloppiness. Every line mattered. Every wall was a prayer. The mistakes of the living could become burdens for the dead. Paint was ground from stone and shell, blues from crushed azurite, reds from ochre, black from burnt bones. Scenes of daily life, gods, sacred boats, and endless offerings filled the walls. Hunting, feasting, sailing. Images meant to carry a soul through eternity. Each line had meaning. Every figure, every gesture, every color was chosen with purpose. The man who painted eyes on the gods worked in silence. Everyone else gave him space. That moment, the painting of the eyes, was believed to awaken the figure. It was a quiet ritual inside the work itself. There was reverence in the brushstroke, devotion in the detail. The burial chamber was sealed off from the casual eye. Only a few were allowed to enter. Priests, supervisors, trusted artisans. Inside, the coffin waited. Gold leaf, carved wood, lapis inlays, symbols of eternity wrapped in craftsmanship. And near it, in small niches, the tools the pharaoh might need. Bowls, sandals, combs, amulets, and tiny carved servants made to work for him in the next world. Even miniature granaries and furniture were placed inside. A whole shadow life, carefully arranged. It was not just about honoring the king. It was about preparing him, making sure he had every advantage in the realm beyond. Outside, the workers kept their heads low. They weren't done yet. They packed away tools, repaired what had been chipped or cracked, a final sweep of the floor, a final inspection of each panel of art. They smoothed fingerprints off walls. They dusted away stray bits of pigment. They removed every trace of themselves from the tomb so that only the pharaoh remained. Their presence was meant to vanish. Only their work would endure. And still, they slept next to it all. Their homes faced the tomb. The same walls they had leaned stones against were now the resting place of a king. But the rhythm of their own lives went on. Bread to bake, sandals to mend, roofs to patch. Children still ran through alleys. Fires were still lit at sunset. Water was drawn from the same well that had quenched the builders during the early stages of construction. There were still arguments over grain rations, still laughter around the ovens. But beneath the routine, a hush began to settle in. A weight. They were approaching something final, something sacred. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. The closeness of a moment that could not be undone. Soon the tomb would close. Their work would be sealed behind stone. And, with it, a part of them. They didn't celebrate. They prepared. They readied their bodies for the closing ceremony, the day when the tomb would be sealed forever, when their work would vanish into stone and shadow. The tomb wasn't just a project. It was an ending. And not just for the king. For them, too. Their names wouldn't be remembered. Their faces wouldn't be carved in relief. But in every painted panel, in every polished block, they were there. And when the tomb was sealed, they stepped away, quietly, not with fanfare, but with the calm of those who had done something lasting. Then they walked home in silence, past the stones, past the gods, into the dusk. They slept beside the tombs they built, not out of reverence, but necessity. The pyramid workers lived in cramped mud brick quarters, a stone's throw from the rising tombs of kings. Not because they wanted to be close to the dead, but because the work never stopped. Waking hours blurred into night, and any extra step was a waste of strength. Some say they were slaves. They weren't. These were hired laborers, skilled craftsmen, men who shaped rock like it was wood. But the pay was modest, and the hours were brutal. What they got in return was beer, bread, onions, and a bed in the shadow of eternity. The dead didn't bother them. The tombs were quiet, after all, safer than the cities. No thieves out here, just jackals and the wind. They built their lives in the margins of death. Children played between half-cut stones. Women cooked over fires that smoked between scaffold poles. Every few weeks, a body would be carried past, bound for burial. No one looked away. It was normal. The line between life and death was thin as linen. Night fell hard in the desert. Stars burned overhead, uncaring. The workers rolled into their mats, muscles spent, backs raw, sleep heavy. Dreams came fast, if they came at all. Some dreamt of cool water, some of nothing. The dead kept their silence. In the mornings, the sun returned without mercy. The crews rose again, stretching, groaning, picking up tools still warm from the day before. Another block to haul, another chant to pass the time. Another day beneath the gods' blind eyes. They slept beside the dead, not to honor them, but because there was no time to walk away. And maybe, after a while, the line between serving the living and serving the dead stopped mattering. Either way, the stones rose. The pyramids climbed, and the workers kept going, tired and holy, half-forgotten, completely human. There was no break room, no shade, and certainly no days off. Life on the Giza Plateau moved to the rhythm of stone, sweat, and sun. You worked, or you fell behind. And if you fell behind, someone else took your place without hesitation. No one was irreplaceable, no matter how good their hands were. The overseers barked orders from platforms of stacked crates and half-finished ramps. They weren't cruel, but they were tireless. Their job was to squeeze time out of men. To them, every delay was a disgrace, every crack a flaw in honor. Kings didn't wait for comfort. Tombs had deadlines too, deadlines carved in stone, not papyrus. To keep pace, crews split into teams: block haulers, chiselers, haulers, polishers, mortar mixers, water carriers. Everyone had a role, and every role had its own brutal rhythm. The sun judged all equally. But the men had pride. Not everyone could say they shaped a slab that would hold the weight of history. Not everyone could stand inside a king's tomb and know their own hands helped build it. Lunch came in woven baskets: flatbread, dried fish, dates, roasted onions, and always beer. Thick, cloudy beer, more porridge than drink, heavy and sour. It didn't cool you, but it dulled the ache in your joints and the blisters in your mind. That was enough. On feast days, the workers danced until they dropped. Lutes played from crates, drums made from hollow pots, clapping hands, keeping time. Jokes flew. Old stories resurfaced, and laughter cut through the dust. For a few hours, they were just men again, not tools, not shadows. Then the sun set, the drums stopped, and they returned to their mats in the stone that never laughed. Some nights, you could hear them singing across the plateau. Not hymns, never hymns. Working songs, short, sharp, and rhythmic. Songs to move blocks to push through pain with. Songs that turned bone into willpower. When the winds were right, the songs carried for miles like echoes from the bones of forgotten gods rumbling through the desert. What they built was too big to see from ground level. They couldn't grasp the final shape. No one could. They only knew the task in front of them. A slope that needed adjusting, a corner that needed smoothing, a statue's eye that needed depth. The pyramid wasn't theirs. But the work, that was deeply personal, sacred, in a way no priest could understand. The builders left no names on the walls, no signatures, no scrolls, just tool marks, scores in stone, chisel grooves like fingerprints, evidence of presence without identity, and those marks, thousands of years later, still catch the sun and whisper that someone once stood here with cracked hands and tired eyes and left something that wouldn't vanish. They didn't build to be remembered. They built so the dead wouldn't be forgotten.